By the end of 1942, in the dust-filled camps of Axis forces in North Africa, German soldiers spoke of the coming enemy with a certainty that bordered on boredom. The Americans, who had landed in Morocco and Algeria in November, were still an abstraction rather than a real opponent, filtered through years of propaganda and second-hand observation. For the average Wehrmacht officer, shaped by campaigns in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, war had already revealed its hierarchy. The Germans were professionals hardened by total war. The British were stubborn but predictable, and the Americans were believed to be something else entirely, wealthy civilians in uniform, inexperienced, over-mechanized, and psychologically unprepared for sustained ground combat. This judgment was not impulsive. It rested on ideology, selective observation, and the memory of the interwar United States as a distant, inward-looking society. Nazi propaganda reinforced this perception relentlessly. American soldiers were portrayed as products of mass culture, physically undisciplined, dependent on machines, and incapable of enduring hardship. German frontline newspapers and briefings emphasized supposed racial weakness, moral softness, and a lack of warrior tradition. The belief fit comfortably with earlier German encounters in the Mediterranean, where British forces, despite professionalism, were seen as cautious and methodical rather than ruthless. The United States was assumed to be an extension of this pattern: industrial strength without tactical depth, material abundance without operational skill. The first limited contacts in North Africa appeared to confirm these assumptions. German reconnaissance units and Africa Corps veterans noted poor American field discipline, rigid command structures, and an apparent reliance on written orders rather than improvisation. Prisoner interrogations from late 1942 described young American soldiers with minimal combat experience, often polite, sometimes confused, rarely hardened by prolonged exposure to violence. German officers recorded these impressions in reports and private diaries, framing them as evidence that the U.S. Army was unready for a modern continental war. To seasoned German commanders who had survived encirclements, winter campaigns, and relentless attrition in the East, the contrast seemed decisive. This confidence shaped expectations at every level. Tactical briefings dismissed American units as slow learners who would crumble under pressure. Senior officers assumed that once bloodied, the U.S. Army would require years to approach German standards, if it ever did. The possibility that an industrial society could compress learning, replace losses rapidly, and adapt doctrine in real time was not seriously considered. In early 1943, the Wehrmacht entered its first major confrontation with American ground forces, convinced not only of victory, but of the enemy's fundamental inferiority, a conviction about to be tested under fire. And as German armored columns began moving toward the mountain passes of central Tunisia, the illusion of effortless dominance seemed ready to become permanent fact. In February 1943, the mountain corridors of western Tunisia became the proving ground for German assumptions. The Kasserine Pass, a narrow gap between the Atlas Ranges, was cold at night and choked with dust by day, its rocky slopes offering little cover and magnifying every mistake. When German armored formations moved forward under experienced commanders, they encountered American units that were deployed hastily, commanded by officers still learning the mechanics of large-scale modern warfare, and bound by rigid chains of command that slowed every decision. For the Wehrmacht, the battle unfolded not as a struggle, but as a demonstration. German after-action reports described American positions collapsing under concentrated pressure, artillery coordination breaking down, and armored units advancing without adequate infantry support. Tank commanders noted that American armor often appeared in exposed positions, moving forward without reconnaissance, then halting in confusion when confronted by coordinated German fire. Intercepts and battlefield observations suggested a command system unable to react quickly once initial plans failed.
For German officers shaped by years of mobile warfare, the engagement felt familiar and predictable, reinforcing their belief that training and experience outweighed numerical strength. Frontline impressions hardened rapidly. Diaries and letters written in the days following the fighting spoke of Americans as brave but poorly led, willing to fight but unable to maneuver under stress. German soldiers noted the abundance of enemy equipment, trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, but interpreted these not as strength but as evidence of over-reliance on material. The conclusion seemed obvious. The United States could manufacture weapons, but it could not yet produce a coherent army. The defeat at Kasserine was read as structural, not temporary. What German observers failed to grasp was the nature of the American reaction already underway. While German units recorded victory and moved on, American command structures were being dismantled and rebuilt with unusual speed. Reports from Tunisia circulated through Allied headquarters, triggering immediate changes in leadership, doctrine, and coordination. To the Wehrmacht, however, this process remained invisible. The only reality that mattered was the battlefield just fought, and on that field the Americans had faltered decisively. By late February, German confidence had deepened into certainty. Kasserine was cited in briefings as proof that earlier judgments were correct, that American forces lacked the resilience and adaptability required for prolonged ground war. The United States was still seen as a secondary opponent, dangerous only in the air and at sea. Yet even as German officers congratulated themselves on a textbook victory, the enemy they believed they understood was already changing, quietly, systematically, and far faster than expected.
By March 1943, the tempo of the fighting in Tunisia began to shift in ways that unsettled German expectations. The same American formations that had appeared clumsy and fragmented weeks earlier now moved with increasing coherence, their advances marked by tighter coordination and a growing awareness of terrain and timing. German reconnaissance reports noted changes that were subtle at first but difficult to ignore. American artillery was no longer scattered or reactive, but massed deliberately, firing with accuracy and persistence that disrupted German maneuver rather than merely responding to it. Infantry units that had previously withdrawn in disorder now executed controlled retreats, falling back behind pre-planned fire zones that inflicted measurable losses. German officers began recording these changes in operational summaries, often without commentary, as if reluctant to interpret their significance. The American command structure, once slow and rigid, now showed signs of flexibility, with decisions delegated downward and units responding faster to local conditions. Tank-infantry cooperation improved noticeably, and German veterans observed that American forces were learning to absorb initial pressure without disintegrating. These were not isolated incidents, but recurring patterns across the front, suggesting an institutional response rather than accidental improvement. Equally striking was the speed of this transformation. In previous campaigns, German commanders had watched opponents require months, sometimes years, to adapt to mobile warfare. In Tunisia, the Americans compressed this process into weeks. Prisoner interrogations revealed intensified training cycles, changes in leadership, and a deliberate effort to integrate combat lessons almost immediately. German soldiers encountered Americans who spoke openly about earlier failures, treating them not as shameful defeats, but as technical problems already addressed. This attitude was unfamiliar to a military culture accustomed to concealing error rather than exploiting it. By the final phase of the Tunisian campaign, German reports adopted a more cautious tone. The enemy was no longer dismissed outright. Descriptions shifted from contempt to guarded professionalism, noting increased discipline under fire and a growing ability to sustain pressure through logistics and reserves.
The Americans were still criticized for tactical bluntness, but the underlying assumption of incompetence began to erode. What unsettled German observers most was not American bravery, which had never been denied, but the realization that the U.S. Army was learning faster than expected and doing so without exhausting its manpower or material base. As Axis forces prepared for evacuation and surrender in North Africa, a quiet unease took hold among some German officers. The Americans encountered in late Tunisia were not the same as those faced at Kasserine. The change was incomplete, but it was unmistakable, hinting at an adversary whose true potential had not yet been tested, and whose next appearance would come on a far larger stage.
On the morning of June 6, 1944, German defenders along the Normandy coast experienced a form of warfare for which previous experience offered only partial preparation. The sound arrived first, a continuous low thunder rolling in from the sea, merging artillery fire, naval gunfire and aircraft engines into a single unbroken pressure that never fully lifted. For German infantrymen manning the Atlantic Wall, the invasion was not perceived as a daring amphibious gamble, but as a mechanical force advancing methodically, indifferent to loss, absorbing punishment while continuing forward. Reports written in the first days after the landings repeatedly emphasized scale rather than tactics, noting the density of men, vehicles, and supplies moving ashore without interruption. German officers quickly recognized that the Americans were no longer fighting as inexperienced formations. Units advancing from the beaches showed discipline under fire, reorganizing even after severe losses and resuming movement once naval and artillery support shifted inland. Prisoner interrogations revealed soldiers accustomed to operating within a vast logistical system, confident that ammunition, food, and replacements would arrive regardless of immediate setbacks. This confidence translated into persistence rather than recklessness. German defenders noted that American attacks did not rely on brilliance or improvisation, but on relentless pressure applied through coordinated firepower and manpower. The psychological effect of this approach was profound. German frontline accounts describe a growing sense of isolation as Allied air power dominated daylight movement and artillery responded instantly to any detected resistance. American units were observed advancing cautiously but steadily, probing defenses, withdrawing when necessary, then returning with greater force. Unlike earlier encounters, these withdrawals did not signal collapse, but recalibration. For German soldiers trained to interpret hesitation as weakness, this pattern was disorienting. Equally significant was the apparent depth of American reserves. Destroyed vehicles were replaced within days, battered units withdrawn and reconstituted without visible strain on the overall advance. German officers contrasted this with their own situation, where losses accumulated without replacement and defensive doctrine assumed static endurance rather than elastic response. The invasion revealed a form of industrialized ground warfare in which endurance itself became a weapon. By late June, German situation reports no longer questioned American competence. Instead, they focused on managing attrition against an enemy whose material flow seemed inexhaustible. The realization was not sudden but unavoidable. The U.S. Army confronting them in Normandy was the product of rapid adaptation, massive organization, and a strategic depth Germany could no longer match. As the front expanded inland, the question shifted from whether the Americans could be stopped to how long resistance could be sustained under such pressure. By July 1944, the fighting in the Norman bocage imposed a new rhythm on both sides, one defined by narrow lanes, earthen hedgerows, and sudden violence at close range. For German defenders, this terrain had initially appeared ideal, a natural extension of defensive doctrine built around concealment, ambush, and localized counterattacks.
Early engagements confirmed this belief, as American units struggled to maneuver armor and infantry through the maze of fields and sunken roads. Yet within weeks, German reports began documenting a shift that was both technical and doctrinal, reflecting an enemy no longer constrained by initial assumptions. American forces adapted with notable speed. Engineers modified tanks with improvised cutting devices to breach hedgerows directly, reducing exposure and restoring momentum. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air support were integrated more tightly, with fire missions planned in advance and adjusted in real time. German soldiers observed that American attacks increasingly unfolded as coordinated systems rather than isolated thrusts. An ambush that halted a platoon would be answered by concentrated artillery, followed by renewed infantry pressure supported by armor approaching from unexpected angles. The contrast with earlier opponents became a recurring theme in German accounts. Unlike British forces, often criticized for methodical caution, American units displayed a willingness to absorb losses while continuing to refine their approach. German officers noted that failed American assaults were rarely repeated in the same form. Instead, each engagement appeared to generate immediate tactical adjustments, reducing the effectiveness of established defensive patterns. The Wehrmacht's reliance on fixed positions and limited reserves was increasingly exposed by an enemy that could reconfigure its methods faster than German doctrine allowed. Equally damaging was the cumulative effect of American firepower. Continuous artillery support combined with near-constant air observation eroded German command and control. Movement by day became hazardous, communication lines were disrupted, and counterattacks were often broken before reaching contact. German frontline diaries describe a growing sense that every defensive success was temporary, bought at the cost of irreplaceable men and equipment. The Americans, by contrast, appeared to treat losses as operational variables rather than strategic crises. By the time Allied forces began breaking out of the bocage, German commanders increasingly acknowledged that they were facing an opponent whose learning cycle outpaced their own capacity to respond. The battlefield was no longer defined by individual skill or localized superiority, but by adaptability, sustained through industrial and organizational depth. As German defenses fractured under mounting pressure, it became clear that the struggle had shifted irreversibly, setting the stage for the final confrontation that would test whether any reserves of will or doctrine remained.
In December 1944, the forests of the Ardennes became the stage for Germany's last strategic gamble in the West. Snow covered the roads, temperatures dropped below freezing, and visibility shrank to a few hundred meters, conditions chosen deliberately to neutralize American air superiority and disrupt coordination. For German commanders, the offensive was built on a familiar assumption that American forces, surprised and isolated, would fracture under pressure. Early successes appeared to support this belief, as thinly held sectors collapsed and German units advanced rapidly through wooded terrain. Yet, beneath the surface, a different dynamic was already unfolding. American responses to the surprise attack revealed a maturity forged over 2 years of accelerated learning. Units cut off or encircled did not dissolve, but reorganized defensively, conserving ammunition, coordinating artillery, and maintaining command cohesion under extreme conditions. The defense of Bastogne became emblematic not because of tactical brilliance, but because of operational resilience. German after-action reports noted repeated failures to dislodge American formations that lacked fuel, suffered shortages, yet continued to resist with discipline and coordination. The anticipated collapse never came. As weather conditions improved, the structural imbalance reasserted itself with force. American air power returned, supply routes reopened, and reserves moved forward with speed the Wehrmacht could no longer match.
German units, already weakened by attrition and logistical exhaustion, found themselves facing counterattacks supported by overwhelming artillery and air coordination. Reports from January 1945 describe American operations as methodical and relentless, advancing despite losses, restoring momentum within days rather than weeks. The Ardennes offensive, intended to shatter American morale, instead confirmed the opposite. In the final months of the war, German soldiers and officers increasingly chose surrender to American forces consciously and deliberately. Testimonies from prisoners describe a perception of predictable treatment, strict discipline, and a professionalism that contrasted sharply with fears cultivated by propaganda. This choice was not rooted in sentiment but in calculation, reflecting a recognition of American organizational control even after victory. By the spring of 1945, German field diaries no longer questioned American competence, they recorded inevitability. The evolution was complete. From contempt to caution, from dismissal to recognition, German soldiers and officers reached a final understanding shaped not by ideology but by experience. The United States Army had proven capable of absorbing defeat, learning rapidly, and sustaining pressure on a scale Germany could no longer counter. The mistake lay not in a single battle, but in the failure to recognize what adaptation, industry, and institutional learning would inevitably produce. When the war ended, that realization remained, quiet, documented, and irreversible.